Hello, everyone. Can everybody hear us okay? All right, a few reactions. Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you for that. Welcome, everyone, to the September Good AI meetup. And it is my pleasure, honor to introduce the keynote speaker, Shankar, who has been here before a year ago. Not here exactly. We used to do this in person. And we had a very large room full of people, and we did hang out. The topic that Shankar covered a year ago, it was relevant and it was important about AI and racism, and unfortunately, it is even more relevant today. And we hope that these voices and the fight that he's fighting, enabling and empowering people, representing people, defending them, it results in something, some place and time where we get to talk about different issues, but racism and AI is a major topic. So without further ado, Shankar, it's just say a quick words, introduce people about Mira, the new project that you're starting, and we can jump into the presentation.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks very much. I do not see myself to be on mute. Can you hear me? Okay, fantastic. Okay, so thanks again, everyone, for having me back. I appreciate it. I think when I last spoke to you all, I was the Technology and Liberty Project Director at the ACLU of Washington here in Seattle. I left that job on January 1st, and I'm now co-principal at an organization that is very nascent. It's brand new. We actually just launched last week, and we're called MIRA, which stands for Mobilize Innovation, Reimagine Agency. And as I go through the presentation, you'll see actually we are intended to be directly responsive to what I see as some of the most pressing challenges that we have in the technology space. And essentially, our overarching mission is to create this flexible structure that will allow us to shift power and change culture in the tech space at scale. So I and my two co-founders are really excited about the organization. We're actively looking for collaborators, and so I hope that this engagement may also result in some of us connecting. So without further ado, let me share my screen and see if I can manage to get to the PowerPoint. So I was basically told not to assume any prior knowledge, on the part of the audience. I know some of you may have been here last year, some of you may not. But I'm going to try to, I think, work through some of the basic grounding in the topic. And for those of you that some of this is a repeat, I apologize. But hopefully, I can add in enough context from the last year that even the old stuff will feel new. So what are we going to do in this presentation? So the idea basically here is that we're, I'd like to build us a common language by talking about the context around technology. It's really interesting. I've been in this space for a number of years now, and I feel like in some ways, I'm like Nostradamus, right? Like, I think that some of the issues I've tried to elevate over the last few years have become much more mainstream now. And I'm hoping that some of the issues I'm trying to elevate now will likewise be mainstream in the time to come. I think one thing that has become a lot more mainstream is this idea that you can't simply have technological or technical fixes to inequity in technology. You need to be able to understand the context of structural inequity around technology. And so in this presentation, the first couple of pieces are really focused on that, to understand what inequity is around technology, to look at a history of technology through the lens of surveillance, and that history could have been written, I think, in any manner. It could have looked at labor technology, for example. It could have looked at a lot of other kinds of technology. I think because policing and the criminal justice system are really in the highlights right now in the public conversation in this country, that's why I picked surveillance. But you could apply that lens, or you could apply a different lens. We'll look at what I call the mismatch problem of community values not necessarily driving the way technologies are implemented. Consider what bias is. Look at some case studies, and then look at what you can do if you're a person in the tech space, or a policymaker, or just an interested person. And hopefully we'll have a good chunk of time for Q&A as well. So let's get into it. You've all seen this narrative. It's all around us in ads that tech is going to fix our broken systems. It's this neutral thing that is beyond the brokenness of our brick and mortar systems, and we should look to it to fix them. As I think made clear last year, and as this intervening year has made even more clear, nothing could be further from the truth in terms of this myth of technology's neutrality. All right, technology is not neutral. Every technology is a set of choices made by human beings, and we have this over trust in the scientific objectivity of tech, and in some ways it's ironic, because the more complicated the tech, the more human decisions go into it, and yet the more people think it's scientifically based. But the reality is there is no neutral, scientifically valid way to build a tech, and each choice that you make in that creation of the technology means different groups end up winning or losing in the real world when the tech is deployed. And tech is released into this context of structural inequity, which I think is something more and more people are starting to realize, and is starting to influence the dialogue around tech. You can't talk about the impact of tech by just looking at tech. You have to look at systems like law, like business, like government policies, education, healthcare, and the media. And those are things that we know to be infected with this structural inequity. To take a very brief pause, because I think this question came up last year, what do we mean when we talk about structural inequity, or if we're looking at race, a race lens, what do we mean by structural racism? So very, very briefly, individual racism is bias or prejudice, right? A person thinks that Black people are inclined to criminality, or that Mexicans are lazy, right? That's individual bias. Institutional racism involves policies and practices that have different outcomes for different racial groups and organizations, right? So if your child welfare investigation unit for some reason focuses on households with more bedrooms, as many of them have tended to do, that's a facially neutral policy, but as it turns out, families of color suffer more from it because they tend to be larger and live in households with more bedrooms. So that's one policy in one institution, and we're talking about hundreds or thousands of policies and hundreds or thousands of institutions. When you add it all up, it turns into structural racism, right? Where this kind of disparate impact of these policies and practices is everywhere you look, and very, very difficult to escape, including really critically in the data that we use to fuel our technology systems. So at the end of the day, the structural racism is a system of power. It's not just individual bias. And unfortunately, we find that those power disparities also affect technology, which is exactly why tech impacts different communities differently, right? It's this power structure context. And because we don't take into account how those systems around the tech are going to impact the tech, not to mention the fact that those biases may be baked into the tech itself. So additional plug for the new organization, right? We are built to try to look at this issue and actually address what we see as a major part of the problem, which is communities lacking this agency and fluency to be able to engage with tech systems. They're not often a part of the initial conversation. They may be brought in after the tech is built. And this means that they have limited impact in countering the effects of these institutions and power structures that are inequitable and concentrate power in a very small number of hands. And as AI becomes more and more ubiquitous, you see the effects of its power concentration. For example, AI-based technologies for warehouse workers at Amazon who are expected to meet productivity rates that are determined by algorithm, and if they miss 3 of them in a day, they get fired. Right? That, if you look at the effect within a structure of power, that essentially is shifting power away from the worker and back towards the employer, even if the employer may be represented by a union and may have been able to get some power in that way over the last decades. And of course, it's really important to. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I think people are not able to see the slides. There was a different display on.
Let's try again.
Yes, now it is moving.
Are you able to see the slides now?
Yes. This is so we are on a slide 9 of 66, right?
Yes, just about. Okay, so are you seeing the slide with the Mira logo, Vikram?
Yes, we are seeing the slide with the Mira logo, slide number 9, but not in full screen. This is in edit view.
Okay, so I'm full screen
We are
right
seeing
now.
slide number 9.
Okay, are you full screen?
No.
You are not full screen. Okay, let me try resharing.
We're not full screen.
Hold on. To end screen sharing.
Sorry about
start
that.
Again. No worries.
Yeah, a lot of people are unable to see the screens moving, and I thought it was just me, so I didn't.
So what I'm going to do is just share my entire screen because I'm not actually seeing a one for my PowerPoint. So here we go. So you should now be able to see the full thing. Is that right? Okay. So I'm not going to mess with it. Okay, good to go? Okay. So we often skip this important question of why and for whom is this technology, right? And I find that to be one of the biggest challenges because, of course, that question and the answer to it determines the trajectory of your entire technology in the world. So a quick look back at history, and in this case, through the lens of surveillance technologies, Malkia Cyril formerly at the Center for Media Justice points out, right, that technology has been used to separate the citizen from the slave and to protect the citizen from the slave. And all of the groups that are listed here have been targeted in some way or other by surveillance technologies, right? Dissidents, the labor movement, the Black community more broadly, religious minorities, and on down the line. And we also see, I think, in this space, this idea that surveillance is a multi-purpose tool, right? The more of it you do, the more benefit you get, or at least that's the mindset, which has led to the targeting of vulnerable communities without suspicion, who are sometimes painted as the threat to public safety, right, rather than people whose safety needs equal protection. Sometimes the surveillance is lawful, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you see mission creep, which is something that I've warned of a lot in the tech space, where tech adopted for one purpose, used for another purpose. Body cameras purportedly introduced to guard against police misconduct then end up being a prosecution tool because, of course, they're pointed away from the law enforcement officer and towards the members of the public. Safeguards may not be effective, and you may end up getting to this space where you see chilling of participation in constitutional activities. And these kinds of surveillances have a very long history. 250, 300 years apart in New York City, we had lantern laws where slaves were required to carry lanterns when they were walking around to make sure that they were visible to allow them to be easily apprehended. And in 2014, Bill de Blasio introduced this program of intense floodlighting of low-income neighborhoods, which many compared to earlier lantern laws, and this idea of making people visible. The Black community has been the target frequently of government surveillance, and a long history that I won't go through in tremendous detail, but a lot of these technological tactics of the day, bugging, physical trailing, photography, blackmail, even fake letters, which were like the fake news of the day, right? Trying to foment division within this community and try to ensure that they were not able to accomplish their Black liberation goals. And of course, there was also domestic spying, and there was this outcry, right? This FISA law was enacted, but since then, as we know from public revelations by Edward Snowden, even FISA's weak protections have been transgressed. This is a local activist, Stan Shikuma, who, talking to an incarceration survivor, he heard this quote, my crime was my face, which I think takes on particular poignancy in a society where we now have widespread deployment of face surveillance or facial recognition, including a broad embrace now of affect recognition. This technology that really has no sound scientific basis that purports to tell if a person not only is experiencing a certain emotion, such as anger or sadness in a given moment, but even beyond that to their proclivities for dangerousness, to take an example. And so, we see echoes of the present in some of the places we've been in the past. This slide, I think, speaks for itself. There has been a lot of surveillance of religious minorities, Mormons, Jews, the Moorish Science Temple are just a few examples. And the surveillance of the Muslim community, for example, in NYPD post 9/11, was really undergirded by a variety of technologies of the day that purportedly had been put into service for more innocuous purposes, right? License plate readers were supposed to be used, for parking violations, for example, or to check vehicles against hot lists. But they were used in the suspicionless surveillance program, along with stop and frisk tactics and after-school programs, and the whole thing failed to catch, a single bad guy. It was based on this premise that the entire community was likely to engage in violence. And a lot of this surveillance-based tracking is still happening, right? So DHS, has been tracking Black Lives Matter as a dangerous group since 2014. The NYPD tracked Black Muslims. We've seen the use of social media monitoring systems, of spy planes that are able to cover cities in great granularity, and even programs where the police would share information with private companies like FedEx and AutoZone. So far from a thing of the past, and that's why, a few years ago, Black Lives Matter actually called for an end to this mass surveillance of Black communities. A call which I think should be particularly poignant in the current moment of movement towards race equity in our country. Okay, so back to the present and how technology is being deployed. I'm going to move pretty quickly, I think, over these slides because I think most of you will be familiar. But we're in a space where AI-based tools make it possible to make predictions that purport to be accurate about what is going to happen. The challenge, of course, is that And again, there are many flavors of AI, as you well know, but the key point to understand is that these are correlation-based tools, right? They find patterns in these massive amounts of data, and they use the patterns to make predictions. They don't really tell you anything about the cause of a given trend, right? And they are only as good as the design of the tool and what data it takes into account and how it weights those various data sets. And this can be a challenge, I think, with our legal system, simply because this approach of correlative-based prediction is not an individualized determination, right? It's not a causation-based determination, which essentially means you're being put into buckets based on characteristics you may share with large numbers of other people. An approach which, commentators, including myself, have pointed out may actually be inherently at odds with our individual-based system and the investment and work it takes to make predictions on that individual basis. This one's not a surprise. We are in this society now where we don't, not only is data power, but we've been fighting for a few years now in both the federal context and the state-by-state based context over who will control this data. Right? All of these important decisions about us involve analytics that are fed by the data stream on the front end, even if most people aren't aware of that. And in Washington State, for example, we have this massive data privacy fight over the last 2 legislative sessions. There were privacy advocates that were arguing there for an approach that more mirrored the European approach under the GDPR, or the General Data Privacy Regulation, even though I think many would say, including myself, that even GDPR is far from adequate given the full range of protections we need, but it would have been a first step. I think what we found was that many of the companies that have been used to being able to freely commercialize our data are really unwilling to allow meaningful agency to consumers over their data. And when that was the statute that was proposed, there was pretty strong pushback. Here in Washington, that pushback came from Amazon and Microsoft, and unfortunately resulted in, fortunately, since the bills ended up being bad, nothing moved in Washington, and it doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon. And this just illustrates, people over trusting data and science, right? Where you have these systems that are purportedly scientific, but actually may be very janky, right? And we've seen instances, for example, in New York City, where a tool that was intended to determine the probability that someone's blood or someone's DNA was part of a mixed DNA sample, right? Essentially a forensic tool that gave a probability that sounded scientific, but the problem was 2 different products by 2 different companies were actually showing results an order of magnitude or several orders of magnitude different. And yet jurors were willing to trust that tool and actually send people to jail on that basis. So that was an unfortunate illustration of this overtrust. You're all familiar with this, the narrative of tech optimism again, and unfortunately it may result in us moving forward without having the discussions we really need to be able to have. And in particular, I think, the challenge that I've seen a lot of is that these are just very different groups of people, right? The data scientists and technologists that build these tools are not the same sets of people as impacted communities. And I think there's growing recognition that this is a challenge, because the communities themselves may define the problem to be solved by technology as a different one. And therefore, their definition of what success looks like would look very different. And there are rarely either public approval processes if it's a government technology, or company practices that get that input into the product at the very front end. And so, a great example of this is risk assessment algorithms, where, we've come to a space where we have all of these algorithms that are static assessments of risk to reoffend of a person sitting in front of a judge. But what we've seen from communities is a move towards outcomes-based approaches, where the question they would like answered is, what interventions will give this person a better chance of not reoffending? And those two tools, of course, are completely different animals. So here's the result you get. It's the wrong problem, the wrong tech. It's harder to challenge. Having a human in the loop isn't necessarily a panacea, and your bias may actually be unfixable. So you may end up entrenching structural inequity with the tool that you put out if you're using these processes. So a quick word on bias, and I won't belabor this point too much, because I think this is becoming more broadly appreciated, but there are literally dozens of definitions of bias and fairness. The Professor Arvind Narayanan, semi-namesake of mine at Princeton, has a video about 21 definitions of bias and essentially their political consequences. And so, I prefer actually not to talk about bias, but really how the design of a tool impacts different groups of people differently, all right? And it starts with the question we're asking the tool to solve, who makes that decision, who the winners and losers are, depending on the data sets and the weighting of them. The data themselves, of course, reflect existing biases, and I think this is the one that I think is easiest for tech companies to appreciate, simply because they see it as a path to a solution, right? When there's a bias, they say, okay, well, let's just get more data into the system, and we can fix it that way. I think the challenge is, of course, that there are all these other ways that bias enters tools, and as we've already observed, they're implemented within power structures. And the unfortunate result is that you may end up worsening inequity with a tool that's not intentionally designed to break down inequity. Because we've been talking about policing a bit, and I wanted to highlight that, Laura Moy had this paper talking about a taxonomy of how AI can advance inequity. And the first thing she points out is that if you're using bad data, you're replicating the inequity in that data. You're also essentially judging the tool, for example, in the case of predictive policing algorithms, just on its predictive power. But as it turns out, your data is biased because in the case of predictive policing, policing hasn't happened equitably as we've seen. Certain neighborhoods have always been over-policed and over-surveilled. And as it turns out, when they studied these algorithms, the thing that they were best at predicting was actually where policing had happened in the past, not necessarily where crime was going to happen. Then there's this black box effect, right, of masking inequity, where it's becoming, I think this has always been a prevalent practice, but it's becoming more and more problematic that in spaces where tools are either used by the public sector or in ways that impact people's lives, like hiring or housing algorithms, that there's still a secret sauce that you can't fully examine. And so that's why you'll see a lot of reports around AI where at least part of the conclusion is, we think that this is the bias in this tool, but we actually haven't been able to crack it open to figure out why it's doing that. And of course, part of the challenge with AI itself is that it's an algorithm that changes over time, right? It internalizes data to change the way it makes decisions. And so even the people that build AI-based tools are not going to be able to necessarily tell you how the tool is working. Then there's this transfer effect, right? So even if you have the best police department in the world, if you use a tool that, for example, relies on databases that are not equitable. Face surveillance algorithms is a good example because the comparison databases are often arrest databases that are skewed by demographic, or risk assessments that are developed using data from a different jurisdiction. You've essentially imported the inequity from the source databases through the tool and into your policing practices. And then there's this magnifying effect, which is also something that I started talking about a few years ago. When I think there was even more tech optimism around these tools, but it seemed clear at the time that the way these tools interact with one another actually has this magnifying effect, and also the way that the tool loops within itself, right, to create a cycle in which you're focusing in on certain groups of people can have this impact of magnifying inequity. Face surveillance layering up onto existing arrest databases, and the fact that the cameras that they use are also layered more deeply into certain neighborhoods. Cell site simulators in Baltimore, these Stingray devices were deployed on the basis of predictive algorithms. And so, of course, any policing that comes out of those tools is necessarily going to reflect the biases of where they were deployed in the first place. And oversight has always been a challenge in this space. I think courts have never been the most tech savvy to begin with. And it's compounded, I think, by the fact that some of the agencies that regulate technologies and the third-party vendors have a close relationship and a revolving door of employees, and that our legal frameworks like trade secret and NDAs have also not kept up with our ability to truly be able to understand how these tools work. It's hard to fix these tools as well. There have been a number of meta-studies, and I think even more since the last time I talked to you all. It's really tough to allow every impacted group to win, right? And I think part of the challenge also is that we rarely press pause, right? We rarely allow these findings of bias to slow us down. And company responses may be narrow and technical, right? Throwing more data into the tool to allow that supposed extra data to be able to fix the problem rather than considering the context of power within which the tool is being deployed. So I'll move, I think, relatively quickly to ensure we have time for discussion. But, you can really find a lot more studies than maybe 5 years ago when I first, started working around bias in these tools. We had all these suspicions. What I can say is I think those suspicions have been justified, tenfold. Because the more we look for these biases, the more we find that these tools are, in fact, replicating existing structural inequity. And all of the systems listed here, predictive policing, risk assessments, et cetera, are all examples. These ones are actually court cases, right? So student test data, processed through an algorithm, teachers get fired, people's public benefits get cut off, children under the child welfare system suffer abuse and die because, in part, the child welfare system is targeting the wrong families. People lose hours with disability caseworkers, and as I noted before, people also go to jail on the basis of some of these untested tools. Lawyers like me are trying a lot of different things in court, and these are all examples. Everything from constitutional efforts under due process, equal protection, challenging your data sets, et cetera, to laws against discrimination, to consumer protection, to labor laws. And I think the best thing we can say is it's sort of this open field right now. There's a lot of shift in the space and not really a definitive answer in terms of what's going to work. And honestly, I think it's going to be challenging until we have new legal frameworks that legislatures enact. So, I kind of put together a trajectory that goes through the criminal justice system, again, given that it's the topic of the hour. I think police body cameras are a classic example of mission creep where, now that we've had them, for a number of years, the meta studies suggest that they actually haven't worked to reduce police violence. And the bigger problem is they are now this front end of an AI-based crime detection system that knits together public and private camera networks, puts AI on top of it, so that it's very plausible to have a scenario where an officer approaching you will have a body camera that facially analyzes you, for example. It may use affect recognition to determine whether you're dangerous in the moment. It may also identify you personally and then use a backend database to make further determinations, predictive determinations about your dangerousness. And again, all of these without transparency to you and without process around what data is being used. There's tons to say about facial recognition, and if we want to take that up in the discussion, we can. But we in the advocacy community have seen this as a game changer simply because it's remote, it's undetectable, it's live, it's after the fact, and it's being widely embraced without public debate. Widely embraced, in other words, by the private sector and by government entities. You'll see that these are a few examples of where it's been used. In the Portland suburbs, in Orlando, by DOL and ICE, and in fact, even here in Washington State, the Washington State tool that was integrated into our driver's license database was used for a number of years to run searches for ICE, which fact was only disclosed to the public after the fact. And of course, to be able to make these databases more accurate, because we know they are not as good at identifying certain demographics like people with dark skin, particularly dark-skinned women, gender non-conforming people. Companies have actually resorted to training databases themselves that are, databases of immigrants who never gave their consent, public or private databases where the use of that database and facial recognition was never disclosed to the consumer. There have been a number of shady practices to feed this hunger for data that AI requires in this context. I already mentioned affect recognition. This has only gotten to be a worse problem since I last talked to you. This is the example I always like to use where, there are two NBA players who, one of whom is dark-skinned, one of whom is white, and the algorithm, determined that one of them was sort of 57% happy and 0.1% aggressive, and the other one was 39% happy and 27% aggressive/angry. And of course, you can guess which one was which. And then, on the back end of these systems, you find this squashing together of a massive amount of data collected by law enforcement, collected by private agencies. Palantir is sort of the most celebrated example of this, where they have tried to create what they call a Facebook of crime to ensure that law enforcement, in order to share data with one another, are actually forced to go through their system. And I think this is another example of how these back-end systems that incorporate this massive amount of data and are making predictions about groups of people are largely not transparent to the public. And the effect spills over into immigration as well. Pretrial risk assessments, another celebrated example. This is attractive because the money bail system is broken and everyone agrees that we don't like money bail, but pretrial risk assessments, it turns out, have different problems, right? They're not based on individualized assessment, they're based on group risk. They actually measure the wrong thing. They don't measure flight risk and community safety, which is what you're supposed to measure under the law. They measure failure to appear and rearrest. And it turns out they're not very good at that either. There was one assessment, I think about a year ago, which suggested that these were actually worse than a random person's predictions about dangerousness of a particular person. And these impacts are, again, systematically biased by race. Then there's the COMPASS example of predictive sentencing, where you can see these two different risk profiles, one for a black person and one for a white person. It was, I think, fairly comprehensively proved in this case that the COMPASS system had a definition, at worst, it was using the wrong definition of bias. At best, it had a system that inevitably resulted in more people of color being assessed as being more dangerous than they actually were. And despite that, the court didn't halt the use of that system. They allowed it to continue, but with procedural safeguards. And at the end of the day, I think what this quote shows is, what we should be talking about is actually what these systems are for, right? That's really what we're talking about. If a risk assessment is intended to keep people out of prison and in the community, then that's the system we should design, not a static risk assessment system, which is a very different animal. Lots of other stuff to talk about in this space, and we can get into it in the discussion. I think workplace surveillance is a particularly interesting one now, given these automated targets, automated weight setting via algorithm. But we took the example of the criminal justice system, but we can illustrate, and there are more studies to show the same systematic bias in all of these different other categories of algorithms. And, we like to talk about Xinjiang as a surveillance society, but of course, smart cities also have that impact. Sidewalk Labs and the infamous Google, essentially, individualized credit score that was managed by Google actually has these uncomfortable echoes of the Chinese system of social credit, resulting in this cycle where, the same people are excluded systematically from the reach of benefits because of the assessment of these tools that then cause them, again, to be undercounted and underassessed by the tools. So what can we do? I'm going to wrap up here and say, as actors in this space, the first thing we need to do is understand and change the distribution of power, right, by understanding how each of our interactions and how each of the products we build impacts power relations out in the real world. We can do that by surfacing assumptions. We can do that by creating better processes that will hopefully lead to better outcomes as well. I think this is really for everyone. I hear sometimes people saying, well, we don't have any power. And yet I think we see movements even within large tech companies where those workers are having their voices heard through shareholder advocacy, through direct pressure on their own bosses. And, ultimately the people who build the technology, have to be able to be a part of that system or it's not going to work. It's not going to work. Ask the right questions, right? Who gets to say no? What power do I hold? And why are we building this technology? Ultimately, we see at Mira that a big part of this is being, building these bridges as a trusted host between the perspectives of stakeholders and particularly community members and policymakers and technologists. And we see a movement to do exactly that, right? Whether it's Tech Workers Coalition, Mi Gente, Athena, this is becoming more the norm. And I think, we're seeing a lot of ethics principles being created. They're unfortunately not particularly effective. Microsoft has their Ether committee, but the AnyVision example resulted in an investigation. They hired Eric Holder to try to figure out what went down there. Google's example was even worse. The structure that they created lasted exactly 1 week because they hired the person from the Heritage Foundation who, unfortunately had made anti-equity statements frequently in the past, and so they were forced to dissolve their accountability body. Many opportunities to engage. I think what I would say, and this is sort of the end of it, is make sure to act where you are. You have levers of action, regardless of what position you occupy in a company or in a government agency. And you can ask these questions when you are trying to pressure towards that change. So I'm going to end there. This is my information, and we can share it out, I'm sure, Vikram, after the presentation as well. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Shankar. Thank you so much. We can take some live questions as well. If I know there are a few questions from Anne, which you'd like to. Oh, Hisham is the first one. Here, I'm bringing Hisham on the stage. Hisham, hey.
Oh, hello. Thank you very much for that. Can you see me?
Yes.
I'm too big, I believe. Thank you very much for that. That's very insightful. I'm just going to let you know that I come from a background of AI and cybersecurity and done a lot of mass surveillance projects. So I learned the hard way for what you're saying. But here's the thing. Before I ask myself, because you mentioned FISA and the Patriot Act, what a lot of people didn't know about Section 215, you know that maybe, and the people that didn't know that it was running, listening to their phones for years, and the only thing they got is one terror plot, and it was just a donation. FISA court, by the way, only applies to naturalized American citizens. So if you live in America legally, it doesn't apply to you. They can access your information at any time. But here's the thing. With FISA, the Patriot Act, and all of these things, the reason I'm bringing that is like these laws were created in specific political climate, with specific, I'm not going to say the name, but with specific political party that was there and that was controlling. And right now, I mean, like we always say, we were just talking about it before you come, it's like democracy is supposed to be the rule of the majority. And the majority of the Americans are liberal, open-minded thinking. But what we see is right now, not just in America, even in Europe, the minority and the fear that these minorities are feeling is what's dominating the political climate and what pushes these kinds. We're seeing that our democratic institutions are being dismantled in front of our eyes. And this is, I believe, how can we can blame the technology as much as we want. We can blame the programmers, but if there is no political system that pushes up for these kinds of changes, like how can we do that if the political system is being biased, deliberately biased?
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, I think you're bringing up an important point. In one of my previous incarnations, I was a lobbyist, right? So I had, kind of a couple of decades of experience, at the local, at the state, at the federal level. And I think, you can, I think the reality is a complicated one, but if you boil it down, political incentives are based on political engagement, right? So I don't think my point underlying here is that we should blame the technology. I think actually the bigger challenge we have is that the technology is making it harder for us.
I didn't say you blame technology. I'm just saying people can blame or point fingers to anyway, but you get my point.
Yeah, no, I do. And I think, political engagement actually will help us create a better set of rules of the road around technology. I think we've seen some halting, sort of faltering steps towards that in the U.S. Congress. We've seen, other places like Europe be a little bit ahead of the United States. I think, they're constantly trying to figure out ways to improve GDPR, even though it's still lagging behind where it needs to be. So I think that political engagement, can allow us to at least have a better set of rules of engagement so that we can crack open, right, the black boxes and not simply have to rely on the largesse, right, of tech companies and their bottom line to keep us safe from these negative, inequitable impacts.
Thank you.
The large. So I think someone's trying to say something. Vikram, do you have the next question?
Hi, Anne. Are you able to unmute yourself now?
No, lost connection, looks like.
No, we're not able to hear. So there are some questions from Anne on the chat. I can ask a few questions. So for first question was, what is... Oh, yes, Anne, we can hear you now. Yes, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I was freezing up a little bit there. First off, Shankar, thank you. That was an awesome presentation. And I hope, I know Vikram told us it's on YouTube, but we missed the first 8 or 9 of your slides, and I'd even like to see those because you did such a great job of building up the story. Secondly, in your slides, you made reference at one point to something called an acronym ADS, and I was wondering what that referred to.
Sure. Yeah, so question 1, I'd be happy to share the slides, and I'm sure Vikram has some way to put them on. And they may actually be paired with the version of this on YouTube. And then in terms of the acronym ADS, it's Automated Decision System. So it's a subset of AI technology that essentially is used to replace human discretion in making
And did you have another question? I think what's happening is sometimes when the connection drops, it puts automatically the speaker on mute. So Shankar is showing mute right now. Maybe you had a slight dip on the connection. And any other questions you had?
No, I muted myself because my dog is running really rapidly. He just ate and he's super energetic.
Okay, great. All right. Sangha, welcome.
Thank you, Vikram. And welcome back, Shankar. Great presentation again.
All right. I'm just going through the list here to see if there are any questions. Anne, did you have another question? I thought you had one more.
No, that pretty much, they were 2 kind of simple questions, but the topic is a fascinating one. And, I think it really does. I was listening to a presentation of student projects from a think tank at the University of Maryland, one of their various AI-oriented, labs. And this one individual gave a presentation about using AI for terrorist prediction, taking an individual, what characteristics does a terrorist might have and who would meet those characteristics. And he was bragging about how you could, as a feature to this system, to these models, broaden and broaden the characteristics to be included as, quote, terrorist, quote, to where I started thinking, the way this, he said religion, region, age, gender, all this kind of stuff. And I started thinking, my God, that could, and then proclivity to terrorism used as a pretext for further privacy intrusion and surveillance. And, it's scary. I mean, you could be a Roman Catholic, and just because certain, tenets of Catholicism say regarding abortion are as they are, you could be included as a proclivity to terrorism,
Right. Yeah. I think that is a massive challenge. I think I'll just highlight a couple of things about that. One is that, affect recognition based tools have already been turned to that purpose. There are a number that have been marketed, over the past several years, and it's raising a lot of concern. In fact, a document I recommend if you all kind of want a snapshot of, reasonably current state of the art in this space is AI Now's 2019 annual report, which came out at the beginning of this year. And affect recognition is one of the things they point at as essentially having no scientific basis. And this is where the point I made about correlation not being causation really comes home to roost, right? That we're attempting to mine data, and we're inevitably going to put people into buckets that they don't belong in. And inevitably, I think the thesis is those buckets will be systematically biased by protected categories like race or sexual orientation or disability status. And we're seeing exactly that trend now. And I think you're also right that what we don't have is a mechanism to be able to say no to these tools, because they are based in these structures of power that are both non-transparent and where we don't have mechanisms for meaningful community input.
Great. And I think it's safe to move on to Sylvia. And it seems like every time you want to say something, the internet connection drops. Sylvia?
Yeah, I could hear some sort of background noise, but I don't think you're on, Sylvia.
Oh, can you hear me now? My computer keeps freezing every time I try to participate.
Can hear you now.
I'm just wondering what other... Okay, great. Well, I'm just wondering, it sounds like you came from the ACLU and now you have another... I haven't checked out your new organization, but is there something, what can other attorneys do in this space to help move things along? I mean, I know that I've done some work. I recently did some work on bias and some recent legislation that Washington State didn't pass, and I found it extremely frustrating. But I just don't know what opportunities there are for those of us that care about this to participate in moving things forward.
Yeah, I think that's exactly why, I started along with my co-founders this new organization, Mira. Our website is mirathefuture.org. And right now we're intending to essentially be project-based. We envision ourselves as a more flexible space to continue some of the work that I was doing at the ACLU. But I think, we would like this to be experimental in service of trying to find methodologies that are scalable. So, for example, I think we're looking to take on a project around contact tracing and the systemic potential inequities around surveillance that supports contact tracing. and how we can mitigate those effects, assuming that contact tracing is going to continue to be around. I think we're also looking at things like misinformation and disinformation, certainly in the electoral context, but of course it's not going away even after the election. So what I see, at least for the next few months, is that we're going to be working through a number of disparate projects as we work to stand the organization up, and there will be opportunities to volunteer because, of course, one thing that we are really trying to do is make this a multidisciplinary space, right? It's not just going to be technologists, it's not just going to be educators, not just community members, not just lawyers, but for us to be able to serve as a trusted host to bring those groups together, which is exactly what we need to be able to do as groups like AI Now are starting to point out, right? You can't fix tech with more tech. And so, I would encourage you, if you're interested, and anybody else who's in the gathering who's interested, to just reach out to me directly via LinkedIn. And as we, kind of determine what the projects are going to be for this immediate stretch of months, we can loop you in.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your presentation.
Great. Thank you for your question, Sylvia. We have a question from the chat. KB Jones, director from Elovent. I am a techie and process engineer. What projects are available in healthcare?
That is a great question. Right now, we don't have any, but I will say that something that we have talked about, and of course, unless you count contact tracing, which of course is about the pandemic, right? And it is, in that respect, it has to do with healthcare. But what's very clear right now is that our regime for medical data is actually even more broken than our regime for data more broadly. It's something that AI Now pointed out in that report I was referencing, that we actually don't have a reasonable system of consent around medical data, and we also have a space where insurance, right, and HMOs are using various data that's either collected directly from patients or is available through the market to be able to determine people's insurance rates, even though that move is of questionable legality. So that piece is something that I anticipate Mira is going to take on. And to answer what you just put in the chat, we have not considered anything around imaging, but I am very interested in hearing project proposals as well. We envision this as being essentially collaborative, where we're not necessarily, we're relying on a community to be able to help us kind of direct some of the energy of this project, and there's a lot from the launch towards scalable projects. So if you have something that's specific around those areas, we should talk.
Great. Thank you for the question, KB Jones. And next up, we have Christopher Davies coming onto the virtual stage. Buffering.
Okay, I can't seem to bring him up on the stage. Chris, if you're listening, you have to accept the mic. Right. I think there was one more question from Kate. Are you considering anything like imaging, CT, ultrasound, essentially diagnostic related AI? Is that?
Yeah, that's the question I just took.
Right. His response did include the imaging aspect of it.
Hi, sorry about that. Can you guys hear me okay?
And here's Chris.
Yes, I apologize. It's quite a walk to get on stage here. So, Shankar, is an incredible presentation. I mean, I just love the depth of what you cover the topic. And I like how you kind of even draw on the picture of like some of the deceptive practices, like how we're being kind of almost sold this idea of how the applications are being used. When you really compare it to how it's being used in other countries, we're critical about, but really we're doing some of the same practices here around, smart cities and facial recognition, but we're not really sold it that way. I really can understand Sylvia's plight. I can see the frustration on her face when she talks about, hey, there's this bill that should have been passed, but we're not. When you look at some of the power players that kind of seem to own some of the processes, I guess, around what gets passed, what doesn't get passed, there's a bias towards some of these institutions. Can you give an example, or have you seen any areas where there's been some headway, some success stories where this bill did get passed and this is how it got passed, to kind of give us an idea of hope, or even an avenue, like what can we maybe duplicate to try to have more wins in that space? Because it's not just AI. These things are happening in every industry and out there. But I'd love to know some of the best practices or some success stories.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked. I think that's a great question. And yes, it is possible to go up against these very powerful companies and government institutions and win. And I think we have several examples of that. I mean, I think one, longer standing one from here locally is the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance. Seattle was the first city in the country to actually pass an ordinance requiring public approval of surveillance technologies. And that, initially was not a success because it was largely ignored. It had no teeth. It had some fatal flaws in the language. So in 2017 and 2018, it was actually strengthened on the basis of, a big push from a pretty broad coalition of community groups called the Tech Fairness Coalition, which is one of I think my proudest achievements as at the ACLU. Because I think what I saw in the space when I came in was that we were kind of talking to the choir, right? There were a lot of traditional privacy activists, right, with a lot of whom were white men. And they were the people that City Council was hearing from again and again, and they largely tuned them out. But when it came to this broader set of groups that actually hold significant political power, in Seattle, I think council members had a harder time tuning that out. So the ordinance was strengthened, and actually it was the first ordinance that required community participation as a part of the approval process. So that happened. It sort of had mixed success since then. But the ordinance itself is still, one of the strongest in the country. I think what we will need more of is a broader engagement of people who care about the issues that the ordinance is raising to be able to ensure real implementation. And we're sort of along that continuum. I think also on the state level, you can look at the data privacy fight as a victory, because it would not have, we would have gotten a really bad permissive data privacy bill had it not been for, a similar coalition, a similar broad coalition of groups going down to Olympia and really raising this issue, particularly with, this interesting sort of coalition of new lawmakers of color down in Olympia, and that number has changed, over the last few years, where there are now more legislators of color than there previously were, and they really seem to get the issue. And so they, along with some leaders in the House Tech Committee, were able to derail the effort to get that really permissive bill passed, despite, I think, a lot of the money and lobbying efforts that were made. So I see that as a good success. There was also a facial recognition bill passed that was at least a very, it was a very basic small step of a warrant requirement and public transparency, and that's there to be built on. So I think these, we've made a big change in how legislators look at these issues. and we need to keep doing that education, right, to ensure that.
To your point on transparency, right? So, Hashim brought up a good point talking about the metadata. Theoretically, how we're going to apply these systems, it seems like it would work, right? But when you look at the metadata, it's like, wow, this is not the course that it's taking, or these are not the results that we're actually getting. Is there a way, or has there been efforts to kind of maybe kind of bring all this metadata together, right? And so, okay, here's a resource where we can kind of look at some of these things, bring some of these stories, some of these failures, some of this misguided direction, and say, hey, we need to start looking at this, because when we, there's probably that much transparency, right? I think a lot of people are just making assumptions based off of what they think it's going to accomplish, but they don't always follow it down the way and realize what's the actual impact. Would that maybe help as far as having a resource saying, hey, these are some of the things that we can't say whether it's 100% spot on, but maybe something that should be considered, and get that exposed out there to some of these developers or things of that nature as well? Is there ways that we can maybe bolster some of the transparency side of things?
Yeah, no, I think that's well taken. I will say, that there's the challenge we have in this space, at least in terms of building substantive tools, is that there can sometimes be a tension between transparency and actual accountability, right? Where, I get the response a lot from companies that, let's just do transparency, right? Let's just pass a statute that tells people what we're doing with their data, but actually doesn't give them any control over it. I think there's some danger, right, when you go down the path of kind of putting all your eggs in the transparency basket, that you don't necessarily get the result that you're looking for in terms of the actual substantive impact. So for me, that's why on that slide, I emphasized not just transparency, but the fairness and accountability as well. And if you look at all those dimensions together, there are now more pieces of model legislation available. Like, for example, in Washington State, I drafted the first AI accountability bill anywhere in the country that was introduced, a couple sessions ago. It didn't end up passing, but I think, that idea now has been glommed onto and actually has almost become this best practice that, groups like AI Now have developed algorithmic accountability tools out of them. And so, I think as we're broadening the education of lawmakers, the possibility of what they'll actually do becomes broader, right? So what I would love to see is people in the tech space actually, rather than talking within their own tech bubble, engage with policymakers and also engage with, the community groups that have been already successful in influencing the direction of policy.
Yeah, I think we'll love to see that too. Thank you so much. We definitely appreciate it.
Great. Up next is Kate Jones.
Hi, Shankar. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, if the video doesn't work, that's okay. So I'm really interested in hearing more about your thoughts on the healthcare space and the industry, considering the data is not only considered, a desire for transparency and accountability, but also privacy. So, medical records, which we all have, can be used to profile every and any one of us. And if there's any errors in your medical record, there are human beings who are making decisions about coverage. I call it your insurance, what's covered, what's not covered, what's approved, what's not approved. Do you have any thoughts about what do you think are the biggest opportunities in healthcare, considering the fact that, many underserved communities and populations don't have insurance or underinsured, and we essentially, if you realize it or not, we all support everybody's healthcare needs through Medicare and Medicaid. So it's not that, it's not that people go to the emergency room and don't get care. They do. And we all as a community, as a society, pay for it. So any particular thoughts on how surveillance and your medical record is, relevant to, what you shared today in your perspective about something that, profiles you, not just your picture, but your data itself?
Yeah, I think that's another great question, and a really challenging one. I mean, I'll say even in the brick and mortar space, there have been efforts to rationalize our medical privacy statutes. There was one there was a bill from Representative Eileen Cody, who's in the healthcare industry herself. She's a nurse, and she introduced this massive piece of legislation that probably 7 legislators could read. And there was a big closed process, and unfortunately, I think the result of that process was that we ended up sort of defaulting protections for medical data to kind of the lowest common denominator. We didn't really get to the point of implementing the protections we needed, even for the brick and mortar space. Not even trying to anticipate where we've gone now, which is the use of medical data in ways that I think are far beyond what was intended. I think you also see an illustration of the problem in the fight over the data privacy bill in the legislature the last couple of years, where what we saw was essentially, apart from big tech and larger companies, ISPs, Comcast, et cetera, coming in to fight, there was also essentially this effort from a whole flotilla of healthcare lobbyists to come in and just try to get themselves exempted from the bill, right? To get particular kinds of healthcare data exempted from the bill. And their argument always was, well, look, it's covered by X, Y, and Z federal statutes, including HIPAA. And although their argument is, hey, everything's covered, I think the bigger, the reality is that that's where we need the protection the most, in my opinion. This was an issue that was important enough that actually AI Now, in their 2019 report, they called it out as being a particular challenge. They called out that one of the top recommendations that they wanted implemented was to ensure that people had some ability to give informed consent for any use of personal data and health-related AI. And I think what we're seeing is, in order to kind of prevent against the future that I've described in broader spaces of data amplifying and reinforcing these historical injustices and social harms, we actually need informed consent approaches in AI health systems, right? Because not only our insurance rates, but actually our treatment, right, is now increasingly being driven by AI. And that's disturbing in the light of the systemic inequities that we know are really prevalent in the healthcare system. So I don't have a particular answer other than to say that everyone agrees that it's a problem. And I think we need to get on it at least as much as we need to get on the broader data privacy problem. And I think we could also potentially take some cues from Europe and GDPR as well.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. And up next is Lisa Ibanez. Lisa, you're muted.
Go ahead. I think you're appearing as green, but no, we cannot hear you.
We still can't hear you, but it's like you're unmuted.
No, it looks like you're not muted, but we can't hear you.
You probably have to go into your devices setting and select mic. Yeah. And this is only happening because you went live. It's Murphy's Law. These things happen with all meeting platforms.
Hashim, were you going to pop in there for a second? Did you have something you wanted to share?
Yes, a quick thing, because when Anne talked about the anti-terrorism and using it, I think I know which video she's talking about. And as someone who worked into counterterrorism, and we were doing that kind of a profiling, I just wanted to, because most of the work that I've done, for example, was in the Middle East, and profiling a terrorist there is totally different standard. Because if you can say, okay, so a terrorist is a Muslim, that's 90% of the people there. A terrorist is a dark-skinned or something, it's like, or someone who goes to the mosque regularly, that's 85 or something. So profiling went more granular there to more even deep characteristics, which, if you remember, Chris, we talked about it, is diversifying. Because if you're not diversifying the police forces, the people who are doing these profiling, you're going to do that again and again and again. And I'm interested in your point, Shankar, about also profile, because that happens in the US, for example, when you profile, you're asking a police department that's majority of white men, that I'm going to say as well, to profile criminals, and they come with their own biases against black people, brown people, Asian Americans, I don't know, all types of other races, and they don't see. So you don't see that diversity, and I'm interested to say that because you worked at ACLU, as I understood, toward trying to push diversity, but couple of years ago, I don't know if you remember that, they were under fire by some right-wing groups that themselves were not diversified enough. If you remember that thing. So I mean, like, our institutions that call for diversity, if they are not playing the role model, how can we achieve that?
Well,
Yeah, I mean,
one thing that you said, just kind of dovetail that. But one thing that you said early on in the speech is like, technology is not neutral, right? It's a set of choices. And so I think what Hashim was talking about is like, how do we try to incorporate some of the back end users to be an influencer in that? Because again, now, of course, what happens from that point is ever changing on its own too, which is another set of standards. But how do we at least start off on the right trend? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's so much to say about that, both in the general context and the context of policing in particular. But, I guess one thing, so just a few quick observations. One is that, it's been systematically researched now in the AI space more broadly that, part of the challenge is that those spaces are not particularly diverse, right? And they have systematic sets of assumptions that keep showing up in the technology for that reason. I think my personal experience has actually been really interesting in that because, I've spent the last several years kind of bringing community members into technology processes. And it really amazes me just what basic, the community members will offer a community expertise that seems like fairly basic knowledge to me, but it really appears to be revelatory to the people that are building the technologies, right? They always say, well, we just had no idea, right? We didn't understand the impact of these technologies. And so that just speaks to the value of getting different people in the room earlier on in the process. So that's one thing. But I think there's also a flip side danger, which is that diversifying those rooms is not going to be the entire solution, right? And we've seen a lot of that as well, right? That you can have police agencies that are diverse, and you'll see, for example, in George Floyd, there was a cop of color that was involved, right? And some of these other instances, same thing. So in the policing context in particular, I think what we've talked about a lot has been the need to reform police departments from the ground up around a completely different concept, right, of community policing and community safety, as that community policing and community safety is defined by the communities themselves. I think we've evolved, unfortunately, to a space where police agencies do pretty much everything for everyone, right? They're the mental health, they're for substance abuse, they're for domestic violence, they're for all of these other things. And unfortunately, they are essentially, trained in a paramilitary way, which means that they can't effectively offer all of those other services as well. So the very concept of policing needs to change along with the people who are doing the policing to make sure not only that more of them come from the community, but actually are policing with community values. And that looks very different from what we have today.
Absolutely. The goal of reform. Lisa's back, and I believe...
Can you hear me?
Boom. Yeah.
All right. It switched my internal mic at some point. But yes, I wanted to say I really enjoyed the presentation. And a few months ago, I connected with someone that actually Vikram had through Microsoft Research. And they have a project through Python called FairLearn to help look at parity in the algorithms. But what I've really appreciated about that group is that they're very much focused on the broader socio-technical considerations, which I think you give a lot of examples of. And in some of the considerations, two things that really got me thinking, it's mostly about helping data scientists think about the broader socio-technical consideration beyond just algorithms through the Microsoft project, but kind of asking the fundamental question of who are we building this tech for, and then probably something that's going to stick with me moving forward, mission creep, because I feel like so many of our grievances against AI currently have to do with mission creep. You know, none of these things were necessarily originally conceptualized to be this way. So I'm thinking a little bit about it from the side of how can we empower data scientists to think more about this, but from your perspective, if you can just, even if it's from the policy legal side, how do we guard against mission creep? Like, what can we do about that, since it's predicting the unknown a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I sort of moved through the last section of slides fairly quickly, but I think, you know, better processes around how we create technology and move it out into the world also includes, you know, a piece about determining, right, what we're trying to do, right, setting that goal in concert with community values at the very beginning. And I think, you know, this is just a part of the process that often gets skipped over too often, right, which determines the trajectory of the technology out in the world. And unfortunately, you know, if you lose that, you've lost at step one, essentially, right? You're not going to be able to alter the trajectory once you've got the wrong goal for the tool you're building. You'll just build that tool. So, you know, what we've tried to do is actually create toolkits that allow accountability, right? And not only, and conceptualizing toolkits as actually a relationship-based process where technologists can go out in the community, they can engage community expertise, actually use that to inform, you know, what they're building, and then continue to work with that group, you know, as an iterative process throughout the building of the technology. So I think, you know, if you're able to do that, right? And what I'll say as well is a toolkit is kind of an inadequate after the fact solution in some ways, because one other thing that Mira is trying to do, and my co-founders are actually both more heavily engaged in the education space than I am, but we would like to reconceptualize technology education, right? The way that we educate technologists. So, you know, because this is a very nuanced thing, right? We don't necessarily want data scientists to take on I won't call it a burden, but to take on sort of the mantle of saying, okay, we're going to go decide what community wants, right? But it's more kind of determining where power structures lie and figuring out how to bring in the expertise of community members and defer to their leadership in the way that technology is built, right? Because I also see a big danger in saying, hey, you know, you go figure out what the community wants. Because I do see, you know, data scientists and technologists that don't know what they don't know in this space, right? And so at the very beginning of how, you know, talking about what it means to be a technologist in the world we have now, I think we need to incorporate that focus, incorporate those questions, incorporate processes so that the people who build in the future are going to have that as second nature, and they won't build technology without that community expertise informing it.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has come up with some of the tools that they're trying to create is the idea that, is this just going to appeal to like early adopters, like the people who are coming to these special groups, and how will it reach the broader audience of data scientists who may not have extensive education on ethics and how to think about this in a more comprehensive way? And I really like the idea that it's not necessarily entirely on their shoulders, that it has to be kind of engaging different systems. So are the toolkits kind of like is this easily accessible on the Mira website, or
so these are previous projects, and okay. You know, what we're going to do is actually make one of our projects the reiterating of this, but this time hopefully with academic resources behind it, so we can make it much more widely available and accessible. So stay tuned.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and Lisa, I actually have a wild idea, and Shankar, you can maybe validate if it's a good idea or not. I was actually a UW alumni. I was actually an American Ethnic Studies major, and the University of Washington is one of the few colleges, universities in the country that still has an AES program, American Ethnic Studies program. So what I'm getting at is, since you're with the University of Washington, I'm not sure if this is possible, but why not tap into the AES department and say, hey, can we maybe do a focus group and trial, take some of your top TAs and students and professors, and maybe get a group of 6 to 10, and then let's pair them up with our own data scientists to see was that helpful, and if it is proven to be helpful, then that can be a program that gets launched, to help private sector corporations before they come out with their wild AI powered product, and before they take any data that's available and hurt people. But yeah, like some wild idea like that.
Well, I'm always open to facilitating research. So, and connecting with anybody at UW that someone might be interested in connecting with. So, but yes, I love doing focus groups and things of that sort. So that stands for Shankar and other people on this call.
I'm just surprised that thing though has a crazy idea.
I'm full of it.
I know you are.
I can go all day.
Far from crazy as far as I'm concerned. I think that would be exactly the kind of opportunity we're looking for. And one of my co-collaborators, one of my co-founders is Henson Hussein, who's at the UW. He's been the head of the communications leadership program there for a while. I myself have sort of been engaged with the law school as well. And I think for us the key really has been kind of bringing together some of the silos that exist in that institution, because it seems to me like different parts of the expertise we need to bring together and the groups we need to bring together actually are just in entirely different schools. And when I talk to different ones of them, they don't seem to be talking to each other necessarily quite as much as we would. So that breaking down silos, I think, is also an opportunity that we would like to engage with.
Do you see re-education efforts being implemented within companies of existing workforce as well? I like the idea. I think it's really key to educate this new market. But have you seen efforts where they're saying, hey, we have expertise even within your own industry, your own company? Are there programs that you're seeing out there to kind of get people to be more interfacing with expertise and re-educating?
Yeah, sort of, but it's behind the curve, and I think it largely reflects the limited understanding of the equity issues that I've laid out in, I wouldn't say all, but certainly the majority of tech companies. Like, I think in one of the slides I put in that the fixes tend to be technical because, they see the problem as being technical, right? They see the problem as being not enough data. And so you get situations where, the response to pointing out that a tool has systemic biases being to actually just push back on that, right? To either say your definition of bias is wrong and here's our definition of bias, or to add in more data. And I think, as my prediction is, as we get towards a space where this idea that, technology cannot be seen as separate and apart from the socio-economic and political systems around it, right? That's getting into the academic conscience. It's not really in the tech industry consciousness quite yet. But I think when that does happen, we will have a better shot of being able to have those real conversations. Because what I see in the tech companies right now is a lot of them adopting ethics principles. A lot of them are doing sort of basic race equity 101 trainings. And those are great, but those are just step 0.0, right? And I think there's a long gap between that and actual ethical creation of technology.
Well, one of the things is, when you look at, machine learning, part of the process is to make some of these mistakes to actually get to the solution, right? So a lot of it's just, letting it work itself out. That's part of what you're designing. Does that slow up the process of, where they don't think that is a real problem, or they think they're going to get to the solution? So maybe it's not something that they address right away because that's part of the whole process, right? They got to go through and filter through that. Is there a way to maybe kind of introduce some of the importance of that earlier on, or try to get that incorporated earlier, so that you kind of find that balance that doesn't get slowed up too much in the process, or like you said, you get caught up in something else, it gets overlooked entirely.
Right, and that's in some ways that's. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I'll talk quick until I freeze up again. What appalled me about that student's terrorist AI model project was that the student clearly had no thoughts about the ethical implications, freedom of speech, privacy, etc. And I suggested to the group, as we were in process at that time, that every student in making such sort of, end of project presentations should have to include at least one slide about the ethical implications of their work. Just as a simple little.
Right. Yeah, and I think one thing that's been pointed out. So I think that is a challenge, and clearly, we not only need to educate technologists differently, but what's one thing that's been pointed out is that a lot of the ethics codes, every company is now adopting an ethics code, but the ethics code tends to be really, really high level, and there's very rarely any actual conception of how it will be operationalized within the day-to-day of how the company builds technologies, right? I still actually have yet to see a company that makes that completely transparent. And so you have situations like the Microsoft situation where they fund a company like AnyVision. AnyVision actually confirms that their product was vetted through the Microsoft ethics process, and all hell breaks loose, right? Because no one understands how a company that builds this product, which I think a lot of people would agree is shouldn't meet a number of the ethical principles that Microsoft has espoused, still got through the process, right? So I think operationalizing ethics and making it transparent to the outside world, is a big challenge. And then beyond that, I think we need to also get to the point where the engineers themselves have some transparency and control over how the product they're designing is actually used. And this is sort of a mission creep point, but it's not quite, because actually what's happening a lot is that technologists are designing multi-purpose AI engines, right, that some marketing guy later decides, is good to be used for X, Y, and Z, and the product goes in that direction. And so, I think a lot of technologists wouldn't want to see their products end up in the uses they end up in, but they don't have transparency or control even within their corporate structure of how it's going to be used. So that's another big problem that I'd like to see addressed. And folks, I have to say, unfortunately, I have to drop off because my dog is going nuts and he's not going to last much longer. I think we were supposed to go till 8. So, Sangdo and Vikram, any last words before I sign off?
No, thank you so much for your time and your presentation again. Your presentation is always one of my favorites, most in-depth, most current, in the now issues that we're facing and we're fighting, and congrats on going independent with Mira. Yes, let's stay in touch together so that we can support each other and share resources. Yeah, I'm also kind of thinking I could probably track down my American Ethnic Studies professor from UW. And though she's not a technical contact, maybe she could be a keynote speaker in the future, just so all us technical AI-related folks, or maybe somewhat related, there's all kinds of people here, including myself. I am not a technical person. I'm not in the AI field, but I think it'd be really nice to hear, from a different perspective, maybe from an academia perspective about inclusion and diversity. But yeah, I'm actually kind of inspired to see how that could work out, Lisa. Like, maybe I'll introduce you to my professor, Connie So, and this is how things can happen and make it actionable. So, yeah, it was very inspiring. Thank you, Shankar.
Thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate it. Again, you can reach me at shankar@mirrorthefuture.org. And, we're looking for collaborators. This was great. A lot of fun discussion. And let's connect offline on these various exciting projects that we discussed. Thanks,
Thank you for your
everyone.
insights. Appreciate it.